Good evening, afternoon, morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I am the Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm so pleased to welcome you to tonight's class on Arthur Szyk. This is the third class in our series commemorating Szyk's 130th birthday. So we have one more class online, and then we also added an in-person session on April 4th. So please join us for that as well if you're able to. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Oh, and I see that some people might be having issues with the sound. Irvin, are you able to hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, if you are having issues, try turning it up, but I will try to speak a little bit louder so you can hear me. So thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that you will visit the museum in person if you're able to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act Rescue in Denmark, the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. You can learn more and buy tickets on our website. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box. So the Q&A box, not the chat, which you can see at the bottom, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Today, as always, we are honored to be joined by Irvin Ungar. Irvin is the world's foremost expert on the art of Arthur Szyk and the tireless force behind the Szyk Renaissance. A former pulpit rabbi fluent in Jewish history and tradition, Irvin is the CEO and founder of Historicana, an antiquarian book firm and small publishing house of Szyk imprints. Beginning in 1987, Irvin first specialized in Szyk's remarkable illustrated books and quickly expanded his repertoire to include original art, fine art prints, and other important Szyk works. He has curated and consulted for numerous Szyk exhibitions at major institutions worldwide. He is the author of Arthur Szyk, Soldier in Art, which won the National Jewish Book Award in 2017, and Justice Illuminated, The Art of Arthur Szyk. His most recent book, Arthur Szyk Preserved, Institutional Collections of Original Art, was published in 2023. Additionally, Irvin is the co-producer of the documentary film Soldier in Art, Arthur Szyk, and the publisher of the luxury limited edition of the Szyk Haggadah. He also served as the curator of the Arthur Szyk Society and its traveling exhibition program, and continues lecturing and speaking about Szyk on university campuses, museums, and other venues around the world. Irvin's memoirs on his life with Arthur Szyk have been accepted by a major university press and will be forthcoming. So you can buy a number of Irvin's books at the link in the chat. So thank you all so much for joining us. And now I'm going to hand things over to Irvin.
Okay, let's share screen here. And let's do this. And okay, thank you, Sydney. And welcome everyone to my third presentation. And I've enjoyed the other so far, and I hope you have as well. And welcome back. Welcome back. In 1933, in the very year that Hitler came to power, Arthur Szyk was invited to come to America for an exhibition of his works on freedom at the Library of Congress. Newspaper photographers on a cold and snowy December day greeted an already famous Arthur Szyk, for he had previously been decorated for his art on behalf of humanity by both the governments of France and Poland in the 1920s and the 1930s. While in the United States, Szyk was asked about life in Europe, where he had been a World War I soldier, director of art propaganda for Poland in its war against the Bolsheviks, a successful book illustrator, artistic editorial contributor to newspapers, campaigner for democracy, fighter against anti-Semitism, and defender of Jewish rights. In one newspaper interview in New York in 1934, Szyk emphatically stated, "An artist and especially a Jewish artist, cannot be neutral in these times. Our life is involved in a terrible tragedy, and I am resolved to serve my people with all of my art, with all of my talent, and with all of my knowledge. In July of 1934, after 7 months in the United States, Szyk returned to Łódź, Poland, his hometown. It was then that he began to illustrate his Passover Haggadah, conscious of his commitment to serve his people with all of his art and all of his talent. His Haggadah was going to be different from all others, for Szyk saw Hitler as the new Pharaoh and the Nazis as the new Egyptians who had come to degrade, restrict, punish, and dehumanize the Jews of Europe. Much, much more about this within the context of the Haggadah itself during my final lecture in 2 weeks, which focuses entirely on the art of the Haggadah. But let me add here, however, for the purpose of Szyk's timeline, that he worked on all of the original watercolor and gouache paintings for the Haggadah between 1934 and 1936 in Łódź. And keep in mind that in 1935, the Nazis had passed the very dehumanizing Nuremberg laws in 1935. In 1937, Szyk moved to London with his wife and daughter to supervise the Haggadah's printing over the next 3 years. And during this period, his anti-Hitler art began to appear in a British magazine, Time and Tide. However, as early as 1935, this image of Hitler standing atop the Reichstag appeared in the London Jewish Daily Post. It shows the Führer with an olive branch in one hand and the Nazi salute with the other. "Never trust a wolf in sheep's clothing" might be its caption. Szyk used to say, "Never trust a wolf that promises to be a vegetarian." In September 1939, the Germans and Russians invaded Poland, and Szyk's primary focus turned to political art, capturing terror emanating from the face of the German authority in Poland. As war breaks out, Poland attempts to defend herself against its good neighbors, Szyk calling attention to the invaders of his homeland from the West and the East and their intentions of conquest, destruction, occupation, and death. Still in England, in January 1940, 4 months before the war began, 4 months after the war began, 72 of Szyk's caricatures and cartoons appeared on exhibition at London's prestigious Fine Art Society on fashionable New Bond Street in a show entitled War and Kultur in Poland. The Times of London reviewed the exhibition with praise, and I quote, "There are 3 leading motives in Szyk's art: the brutality of the Germans and the more savagery of the Russians, the heroism of the Poles, and the suffering of the Jews." The Times reviewer concluded that the, quotes, "cumulative effect of the exhibition was immensely powerful and Szyk's pursuit of an evil so firmly grasped." Almost also immensely powerful was Szyk's personal friendship with a man who had significant impact on his life, with revisionist leader Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky, whom I mention at this particular moment in my chronology, for Jabotinsky died later that year in August of 1940. The two had been close since Szyk's earliest days in France in the 1920s. In his 1927 diary, Szyk wrote of Jabotinsky's visiting him in Paris, bringing news of his mother's well-being back in Łódź. Szyk went on to illustrate Jabotinsky's 3-volume book of poetry, published in Paris in 1930, and later his cover and frontispiece of Samson for Prelude to Delilah. If Szyk ever had a mentor of any kind, it was Jabotinsky, who in the early 1900s in Odessa and elsewhere organized Jewish self-defense and military units to safeguard Jewish communities. Together with Joseph Trumpeldor, another of Szyk's heroes, he co-founded the Jewish Legion of the British Army in World War I. There is no question that Szyk's fighting spirit as a fighting artist was significantly influenced by Jabotinsky. Their wives remained close even after the Zionist leader died. Here, they are seated at a New York banquet together with the wife of prominent Zionist organization co-founder Max Nordau. Arthur Szyk's wife, Julia, is on the far right, and Jabotinsky's wife is in the center. In addition to his speaking through his art, Szyk saw himself as a spokesperson in London for the Polish Jewish refugees who were living there, and serving as president of the Association of Jewish Polish Citizens in Great Britain. And in his position, he emphasized cooperation between Poles and Jews, and he often met with leaders of the Polish government in exile that was then based in London. It was this pro tem government then, in mid-July 1940, together with the British government, that supported Arthur Szyk's move to North America in order that he might bring the face of the war in Europe to the Western world. Szyk first arrived in Canada, where the Halifax Herald announced that Hitler had placed a personal price tag on his head. So potent and powerful was his anti-Nazi art in Europe. At an exhibition held in Toronto, Szyk was recognized for his art in the service of humanity, while he is quoted as saying that art must be mobilized like everything else. In October 1940, Szyk immigrated to America, and almost immediately his art began to appear everywhere, at first serving as a warning to the people of America about the Nazi threat, and then to mobilize American war efforts. Here, Szyk portrays a madman's dream. Hitler sits on his throne, surrounded by his Axis supporters, the world almost in his lap, the Jew as the Untermensch, the subhuman, to be trampled upon at his feet, while Uncle Sam and John Bull, the US and Great Britain, are in chains. This is a madman's dream, which Szyk is clearly depicting for the American public well before the United States enters the war. And while published in Coronet magazine, Szyk warns that if America does not pay attention, this will be the result. A drawing appearing in the American Mercury magazine, again, before the United States entered the war. At the bottom right, at the bottom on the far right is Hermann Göring, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, holding a tiny airplane. And at the bottom left, standing, isolationist and anti-Semite Charles Lindbergh, raising his hand with a Nazi armband in support of a fascist form of Lady Liberty. In July 1941, Szyk's The New Order was published in New York, the first anti-Nazi book of its kind, attacking the Nazis' New Order. Szyk contemporary Roland Kirby, the first winner of the Pulitzer Prize for editorial cartooning, remarked that, and I quote, "Arthur Szyk's cartoons are different from anything ever turned out in this country," end quote. Among its pages, Szyk's New Order paints a picture of the defenseless huddled Jews as if to say, these are the enemies of the Third Reich, really? These people present a threat to Germany? With the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the United States declared war on Japan, and 3 days later on Germany. And it is Arthur Szyk's art of Ishiroku Yamamoto, Admiral of the Imperial Japanese Navy, that appears on the cover of Time magazine. Newspapers, the New York Post, the Chicago Sun, and PM, magazines, Collier's, Esquire, Look, Liberty, Time, publish Szyk's art. The American press sees him as a one-man army conducting a one-man war against Hitler, fighting the dictators with pen, brush, and venom. The American military calls Szyk a citizen soldier of the free world. Eleanor Roosevelt writes about Szyk in her nationally syndicated newspaper column, My Day. His work fights the war against Hitlerism, she writes, as truly any of us who cannot actually be on the fighting fronts today. In the work on the right, Szyk inscribes his portrait of the American president to Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt from Arthur Szyk, FDR's soldier in art. While Norman Rockwell is illustrating the covers of the Saturday Evening Post, Szyk, an illustrator of another kind and leading propagandist for the Allied cause, is illustrating the covers of Collier's magazine. Here is Arsenal of Democracy, which appeared with the Labor Day issue, motivating Americans to work in supporting the war effort, as the Nazi serpent, swastikas painted on its back, attempts to strangle the pillars of democracy. As Szyk continues to fight two wars, one against the Axis and the other on behalf of the Jews, his mantra is clear: the Jewish artist belongs to the Jewish people, and it is his mission to enhance the prestige of the Jews in the world. His task is to reveal to the world of our glorious past and our tragic present. That prestige is clearly evident in American Jews fighting for Jews abroad. Szyk, conscious of the role of the Jewish soldier can play in the war effort, and he presents them in support of the Jews of Palestine and serving under the banners of the Allied armies. Simultaneously, while fighting the Axis abroad, Szyk is concerned with America's internal divisions regarding its race relations with Blacks and anti-Semitism within its own borders. And in response, in one approach, Szyk enlists several images to fortify his position of needed unity in the United States. He understood how a more unified America would benefit his own people on both sides of the Atlantic. Here, an example of this can be seen in his Black, White, and Jew, United in Common Cause, at a time when Blacks and whites served in segregated units in the US military. Similarly, Szyk frames America as a country of limitless strength when its citizens, Irish and Jews, for example, the Kellys and the Levins, can unite across its differences. And if so, a sweating Goebbels with both arms raised would have to admit, if we don't destroy that team, we are doomed. Indeed, there was a real bond between the actual airmen, the Presbyterian pilot Colin Kelly, and the Jewish bombardier Meyer Mike Levin. Levin being celebrated in many circles as the first Jewish American war hero. This work was one of many of Szyk's, which, in addition to its appearance in the New York Post, was also reproduced for publications and magazines of the Jewish war veterans of America, which he also admirably served through his art. Amidst this unity of purpose advocacy, where Szyk is tirelessly fulfilling his twofold mission in fighting both for the Allied cause and the rescue of European Jews, he vividly emphasizes the ongoing and unfinished Jewish tragedy. Here, in this 1943 drawing, Hitler, Goering, Goebbels, and Himmler are gathered around a table upon which is imprinted, Gestapo reports 2 million Jews executed Heil Hitler. Behind them hangs a skull and crossbones banner labeled European Co-Prosperity. The faces presented here show signs of disgruntlement. Only 2 million? As if to say, Europe needs more prosperity than this, more Jews to kill. This is among Szyk's most personal drawings, as indicated by his dedication in the upper right, to the memory of my darling mother, murdered by the Germans somewhere in the ghettos of Poland. As it turns out, his mother and brother were taken from the Lodz ghetto on separate transports and murdered in the Chełmno killing center. This drawing, another early 1943 work, features two Jewish children hauled before the Nazi tribunal. In front of the seated Himmler is a broadside reading, "The Eastern region must be cleansed of Jews. The innocent doe-eyed boy and girl are dangerous enemies of the Third Reich," a theme similar to his New Order image of huddled Jews shown earlier in this presentation. A portion of this drawing of the boy and girl were among Szyk's most reproduced on poster stamps, posters, on fundraising packets, and magazine covers during the war. There is no question in my mind that Szyk's masterwork, De Profundis, is not only his most important Holocaust drawing circulated during the war, but the single most important Holocaust work on paper produced by any artist during World War II. And therefore, it's highly worthy of our spending time with it together. Its title, De Profundis, are Latin words for out of the depths. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord, from the depths of human suffering. These words come from Psalm 130, a psalm important for both Jews and Christians and recited in their respective liturgies. What we see here among lifeless and dying Jews is that from the very beginning, this work is drawn to appeal to the widest of audiences, emphatically emphasized by the appearance of Jesus in the upper left, holding in his hands the Ten Commandments, a fundamental text common to both Jews and Christians, as if to say, were Jesus alive at that time in 1943, he too would have been killed as a Jew, murdered with his people. With this being said, I would briefly like to enter two other monumental war-related artworks into our discussion. In 1937, Pablo Picasso created Guernica in response to the German bombing of that Spanish city. In 1938, Marc Chagall in Paris painted White Crucifixion as a result of the events of Kristallnacht in Germany and Austria. And as he once said, in response to his friend Picasso and his Guernica painting. In White Crucifixion, we see among a myriad of things going on, a burning house, a burning synagogue, a Jew fleeing with his possessions, another with a Torah scroll, and a large central figure of Jesus on a cross. This painting, I might add, is uneasy and controversial for many Jews and Christians. A painting, nonetheless, which happens to be Pope Francis's favorite work of art. What do Picasso's Guernica and Chagall's White Crucifixion and Szyk's De Profundis all have in common? They all paint a record of human tragedy. But Arthur Szyk's does something the other two paintings do not do. By adding the biblical text of Cain, "Where is Abel thy brother?" Szyk calls for accountability. Who is responsible for this human tragedy? Who will be held accountable for this pile of dead bodies? Just as God called upon Cain to come to terms with responsibility for murdering his one and only brother. Notice here in the details of the C of Cain, Szyk has painted a swastika, and in the A of Abel, a Star of David. But now, let's take a step back for a moment and for a more underlying look at accountability for universal Jew hatred leading to the mass murder of Jews. Let me set the stage. As is clear, almost all of Szyk's artworks were created for the purpose of reproduction in newspapers, magazines, books, posters, poster stamps, etc. If so, Where was De Profundis first reproduced for the public to see? And who was behind its publication? It first appeared full page in the Chicago Sun newspaper on February 12, 1943, just a little over 2 months after the Roosevelt administration and American Zionist leader Rabbi Stephen S. Wise announced to the public that 2 million Jews had been murdered by the Nazis. How did De Profundis come to appear in the press as a full page with accompanying text? Who was responsible for putting it there? Was it the owner of the newspaper? No. Was it the editor-in-chief of the newspaper? No. Which Jewish group paid for it? None. Then what group sponsored it? It was paid for by the Christian Textbook Commission as part of the Protestant Digest, by a Protestant group in America. And how do we know? Simply because it is indicated in the text below, which admits that as Christians, we must be held accountable for this tragedy, stating further, and I quote, 2 million sensitive human beings are being tortured, starved, butchered in an orgy of hate, reaped by Hitler, but sown in the very soil of Christian civilization, sown in the textbooks and the texts of intolerance. Adding, the Christian textbooks in America are responsible for fostering hate-breeding falsehoods about Jews and poisoning the lips of children by their anti-Semitic statements. And so it is to Szyk's art we turn, which fights hatred and mass murder abroad, but used also to address historic European anti-Semitism, as well as the contemporary ugly picture of American anti-Semitism in the 1940s. For not only does the text condemn Christianity's millenniums-old Jew hatred, but addresses the truths that its anti-Semitism is also anti-American and anti-Christian itself. In addition to the Chicago Sun, this artwork was reproduced elsewhere in magazines and newspapers throughout the US and used as the basis for lectures and discussions. Hence, the great art, given its multi-layered, powerful, and painful message, its context, and its widespread circulation, all contribute to my reasoning that this may well be the single most important Holocaust work produced during the war. In April 1943, on the first day of Passover, German tanks entered the Warsaw Ghetto to liquidate its residents. Szyk chronicled the heroism of his brethren in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising with his repulsed attack, and 2 years later, while the war was still going on, with Samson in the ghetto, which he dedicated around its borders from the bottom left, moving up the left margin, to the German people, sons of Cain, be ye damned forever and ever. Amen. Palestine Restricted features the Nazi vulture prepared to swoop down on Europe's terrified, dazed, and angry Jews, while the gates to Palestine are padlocked by the 1939 British White Paper, the document significantly restricting the freedom of Jews to emigrate from Europe to Palestine. Below the word restricted, Szyk has inscribed March 31st, 1944, the end date after which the White Paper quota of allowing merely 15,000 Jews per year, that is up to 75,000 over 5 years, of the millions of Jews in need of refuge in Palestine, that date, all, quote, all immigration would stop. After that, no Jew, that is, no Jew after March 31st, 1944, would be permitted entry unless the Arabs of Palestine granted permission. Szyk knew the blasphemy of this and was repelled by the date and numbers of the chokehold on the Jews by a country that he once admired. And his art expressed his outrage toward the British until the day that he died. Note also in the bottom right vignette, in the armband with the Star of David of the fallen Jew, with dried tears fallen on his cheek, Szyk has inscribed his name. Arthur S. is visible, hence personally identifying with his kin, those murdered among his people. This was all so deeply Arthur Szyk. This image of Palestine restricted would live on. It would make its way onto posters in gatherings, as shown here within a synagogue, and onto the cover of a report to the President of the United States in an attempt to engage Harry Truman's support for the creation of a Jewish state after the war. The report was submitted by the Political Action Committee for Palestine, whose co-chairman was activist Rabbi Baruch Korf. To return to the white paper, with resilience, response, and moral clarity, Szyk drafted his indictment of the venomous policy document. The smaller snake in the very bottom right corner is the Nazi serpent with swastikas on its back, lurking in the grass. The focus of this painting, however, is the larger snake, entwining itself around the defiant Jewish soldier, which is the snake of Great Britain's white paper. Again, Szyk's attack on England's mandate. The marginalized British Balfour Declaration, announcing in 1917 its support for the establishment of a national home for the Jews in Palestine by the British, is shown here in the bottom left and blown up, overridden by a chameleon, symbolizing a government which has changed its colors. Some of Szyk's stronger, more militant images of fighting Jews would appear and reappear in 1942 and 43. These included Trumpeldor at Tel Chai, which was painted in Lodz in 1936 at the suggestion of Szyk's friend Ze'ev Jabotinsky, to inspire a heroic response to the Arab riots taking place in Palestine at the time. But it was repurposed by Szyk in 1942 and renamed the Modern Maccabees. Beside the Modern Maccabees stood a brilliant, militant modern Moses, no longer supported to his left and right in battle by his brother Aaron and nephew Hur against the biblical Amalekites, but by his comrades in arms, a religious Jewish soldier with an American rifle and an industrious worker with a revolver fighting against a modern Amalek. These artworks were reproduced and circulated widely by the Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe, a Peter Bergson Group. More about Bergson in a moment. Here, Szyk's rage at the murder of his people is channeled through the soldier toward action, not pity, as he dedicates tears of rage to those people, those of my people, who fight for the right to die with their boots on, my pride, my love, my devotion. Szyk adding in parentheses, to those of you who tuned in late. This artwork appeared both in the New York Times and the Washington Post and numerous other publications, and was sponsored by the Committee for a Jewish Army of Stateless and Palestinian Jews. This was another example of the several non-sectarian groups organized by Peter Bergson. Formerly, his name was Hillel Cook, a Palestinian Jew who had come to America and whose activism took aim both at the inaction of the United States government and those American Jews whom the Bergsonites saw as not doing enough toward the rescue of European Jews. This committee for a Jewish army drew on great support from the non-Jewish community, counting among its leaders Congressman Will Rogers Jr. of California and Senator Guy Gillette of Iowa, journalist Pierre Van Passen, and a young Marlon Brando. Among its own ranks were Jews such as famous screenwriter Ben Hecht, author of the We Will Never Die pageant, collaborating with producer Billy Rose, director Moss Hart, and musical director Kurt Weill, held in 6 cities, New York, Washington, and Boston, as well as Philadelphia, Chicago, and Los Angeles. This theatrical enactment was intended to call attention to the American public the urgency of needed response toward the rescue of Jews. Szyk's art was everywhere, always created for reproduction, whether as prints for those who supported Bergson's groups or as program covers wherever fundraising rallies and events were held, or as poster stamps to be placed on envelopes promoting Jewish relief. In the Ballad of the Doomed Jews of Europe, as well as with De Profundis, our time is well invested here as we witness the power of words and graphics together addressed to an apathetic world filled with indifference to suffering and dying Jews. Here, the collaborative pen of Ben Hecht and ink of Arthur Szyk combine to present a condemnation of the US State Department and those who were busy with other news and would celebrate Christmas, peace on earth, without the Jews. Hecht and Szyk calling to account publicly those turning away from the slaughter of their innocent brethren, including the need for American Jews to speak out more forcefully. 4 million Jews waiting for death. Oh, hang and burn, but quiet, Jews. Don't be bothersome. Save your breath. The world is busy with other news. 4 million murders are quite a smear, for even our State Department views the slaughter with much disfavor here, but then it's busy with other news. Let us focus now on the details of Szyk's art. Jews in the lower left border face their imminent extermination, pleading with the world to intervene on their behalf. As the Gatling gun barreled to their right, armed by 2 German soldiers and directed by the standing Nazi officer, is about to be fired, a frantic young girl makes a desperate telephone call. The phone cord winds its way upward past a religious Jew clutching a Torah scroll, with family members holding babies by his side. The cord passes Uten, hanging from the gallows, to a young woman identified by the word switchboard, which is pointed to by the bottom blue arrow, who directs the telephone call to the soldier at the top, identified as United Nations by the top arrow, with the word ring by the telephone, with the words, sorry, they don't answer, coming from the switchboard operator. All the while, the duet of the angel of death and the tuxedoed skeleton on the cello play the music of the 4 freedoms, below which is the word restricted. Freedom of any kind does not apply to the Jews. This artwork was completed in March 1943, within 1 month of Szyk's De Profundis appearing in the Chicago Sun. Upon the submission of the ballad artwork by the Bergson Group to the New York Times as a paid advertisement, and though paid, someone at the Times halted its publication. Having once owned this original artwork, I can tell you that the words "wait order" in red capital letters were stamped on the bottom margin, testifying to this action. It was withheld from appearing in the newspaper while the New York Times contacted Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, head spokesman for American Jewry, as president of the Zionist Organization of America, who angrily castigated Peter Bergson and his group for daring to go beyond him with their activism in publishing their criticism of the State Department. This was what but one example of the strong and acrimonious divide between Rabbi Wise's approach of trust in FDR and the Bergson boys' mistrust of an administration underwritten by its anti-Semitic influencers. The ballad, however, appeared the following month in the Answer magazine with Heck's text and Szyk's art, and 6 months later, finally, in the New York Times, but without Szyk's art around the borders. Regarding his work for the Bergson groups, Ben Hecht wrote in his autobiography, A Child of the Century, about his friend. How or why Arthur Szyk became our one-man art department, I never found out. He appeared among us one day like a bonanza on the doorstep, and thereafter he illustrated all the ads I wrote. He drew program covers for all the pageants I invented. He drew posters and pictures for throwaways at rallies, for invitations to shakedown dinners. He worked for 8 years without pause. Nobody paid him anything, and nobody thought of thanking him, nor was he an unknown artist using a cause to add luster to his name. It was already one of the most illustrious names in international art. And in 1945, with the war at its end and the unspeakable murder of Europe's 6 million Jews, Szyk declared, "Every Jew now alive is the legatee of those who died to uphold the sanctity of the name or dignity of his origin." Szyk transforming the yellow badge of shame to a yellow badge of honor, al Kiddush Hashem, for the sanctification of God's name. Yet despite the war's end, misery continued to prevail for Jews consigned to the displaced persons camp, the DP camps of Germany and Austria, who awaited evacuation to Palestine. Bergson's group, the American League for a Free Palestine, for which Szyk served as one of its vice chairmen, called attention to those confining conditions. His art, Lullaby for Dying Children, shows a Holocaust survivor holding his dying son, who in turn clutches the British restrictionist policies directed toward the Jews while they hope for new life in Palestine. Szyk's Pilgrims calls attention to the Mayflower and the, quotes, illegal passenger ship, both trying to break free from the British yoke. One in the 17th century making its way to America, the other hopeful of breaking through England's mandate over Palestine. And all the while, the British insist, as Szyk records, just one step backwards, please, for the Jews tried to crawl up out of the DP camps and overcome the British giant, symbolized by John Bull, as they attempt to scale whatever heights are necessary to grab onto the ledge of hope by ascending to the land of Israel. Following the declaration of Israeli independence on May 14th, 1948, Szyk's wife, Julia, wrote in her memoirs, "When Israel was declared independent, we were at home with some friends and heard the news over the radio. Arthur cried for joy. It was a dream of his life that had come true. He was the happiest man in the world. He sat down the next day and made the Declaration of Independence of Israel. It was a magnificent scroll with all the dreams of his youth. Palestine was always his personal concern, and those who fought for it were like his own children. He felt like they belonged to him. And those children, young men and young women, and now their children and children's children, have continued their sacrifice to the present day, as we are reminded by what Thomas Jefferson once wrote, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." And despite Israel's attempt to defend itself against the 5 Arab nations which attacked the Jewish state upon its declaration of statehood, the United Nations turned against the Jewish people, calling for an end to their fighting to defend themselves. The UN Security Council would meet in 1948, and Szyk would respond to the greatest mockery of them all, the Security Council of June 1948, with security in quotes at the top, the council consisting of China, Syria, and Great Britain, with a mock scepter and gesture of Belgium, which itself wanted a mandate over Palestine, all cautioning Israel, symbolized by its soldier, hands chained by a UN embargo, saying to the Jewish people, this Security Council, we agree with you on every point, except your stubborn insistence on surviving. Sanctions would be placed on the Jewish state, and again, Szyk would respond. The young Israeli soldier asks his grandfather, while he's reading through Psalm 23 of walking through the valley of the shadow of death, the young Israeli soldier asks, tell me, grandfather, what do they call sanctions? The elderly man answers, that, my child, is the way we have lived among them for 2,000 years. And the future of Jerusalem would be contested from time to time. And again, Szyk would respond, indeed, an Arab Jerusalem is as absurd as a Jewish Mecca. And here, the text references Psalm 137, if I forget you, O Jerusalem. And while Szyk went on to create works of art to support Hadassah and its youth Aliyah, the United Jewish Appeal, the Magen David Adom, Israel Bonds, he remembered deeply and paid tribute to the 6 million martyrs of his people and the aftermath of the Shoah, symbolized by the eternal Yizkor for all future generations. In this simple pen and ink drawing, Szyk acknowledges through the Hebrew text of the book of Exodus the eternal need for God and man, both, to extend a strong hand and outstretched arm of constant vigilance and guardianship on behalf of his people. I would like to conclude with words from Ben Hecht again, who during the war years, as a Szyk kindred spirit, witnessed from the inside Szyk's eternal devotion to his people. His Hebrews, under fire, under torture, exterminated in lime pits and bonfires, did not change. They remained a people to be loved and admired. Their faces, fleeing from massacre now, were tense and still beautiful. There was never slovenly despair or hysterical agony in Szyk's dying Jews, but only courage and valor. If there was ever an artist who believed that an hour of valor was better than a lifetime of furtiveness and cringe, it was Szyk. And just as the Irgun produced the first fighting Jew since Bar Kokhba, Szyk put him on paper for the first time. He died, still drawing for the Jews. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Urban. So I think we can move into questions from the audience, if that is good with you. All right, let's do it. Thank you for that also. So so the first question we have is, in De Profundis and other works that we've seen throughout this course, did Arthur Szyk use the faces of people he knew to depict the people in his paintings?
It's an excellent question. I'd like to know the answer myself, except after numerous discussions with Arthur Szyk's daughter, whom I mentioned I was friendly with the last 25 years of her life, and she died, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. I used to discuss this with Alexandra all the time. Well, not all the time, but whenever we did. And she couldn't identify any of the figures, and she could not answer the question for me. I even asked if the elderly lady could have been his his mother, and she wasn't sure. There is in numerous works of his, particularly in his first book of Esther. It's just Purim the other night, so it's worth mentioning Esther. But in his first illustrated book of Esther in Paris in 1925, Esther was Arthur Szyk's, the picture of her was Szyk's wife, Julia. And Alexandra confirmed that, and she's really beautiful. And everybody used to talk about that I interviewed and what I read is that Julia was very, very beautiful, and Szyk painted her within the book of Esther and elsewhere. But no, we really can't. We really don't know who these figures were. I don't know.
Okay. Thank you. So another question is, what is the music score depicted on For Freedoms?
The answer is I don't know. I honestly actually haven't examined that musical score. What I can tell you is I've examined musical scores on other works of art that Szyk did, because there's at least 2 others that I know, and I've asked people about them. And in one case, the musical score was very accurate, that he was actually the musical score had something to do with the Nibelungen Ring of Wagner, and so it was very accurate. And in another case where he used a musical score that had absolutely no meaning at all. On this one, I have to plead neutral. I don't know the answer to either of those sides, whether it was accurate or whether it was just a score. It'd be easy to have answered this by saying it's a bar from some musical score depicting the 4 freedoms, but I don't know. They're playing music, obviously, but what the music is. The music probably was 4 freedoms restricted. If someone wrote those words, it's probably what that was. But I honestly, I don't know.
Right. Well, thank you for giving us your best guess. So another question that we have, I think you mentioned one art piece about this, but you mentioned how Szyk was doing a lot of work about the white paper. And did he ever do art, I think besides the one piece you mentioned, which I forget the name of, my apologies, about, did he do work about the limitation of Jews to immigrate to the United States?
No, but he's dealing with the U.S. State Department, and so they're the influencers, and they're the ones who are sort of, they have Roosevelt's ear, and he wasn't afraid to put his pen to that criticism. But I can't think of any other work. Of course, he was constantly working, the rally of the rabbis, Szyk was involved. I've seen a picture of him among leaders coming to protest. But the answer is, I can't think of any other piece about immigration, but everything was about immigration in a way.
Right.
Not only that,
Thank
and
you.
Jews, so.
For sure. Thank you. And then he did do works about the DP camps that you showed us afterwards. Did he go to the DP camps after the war, or was this based on like secondhand accounts that he was getting?
No, he did not go. I'll take this opportunity to answer another question. Many people have asked me, did he ever go to Palestine? Did he ever go to Israel? And the answer is, which I did mention in another lecture, is that he went when he was in 1914. He was there for about 6 months. He never went back. If the war's over in 1945, Szyk's working here towards the creation of the Jewish state. And, starting in 1948, he had a minor heart attack, and then another, I think it was very hard for him to travel. But so the answer, I'm using this to answer about his going to Israel, but the answer is no, he did not go to the DP camps.
Thank you. So was there ever concern by Szyk or others that his, caricatures or like kind of cartoonish depictions of Hitler and other Nazi leaders would make them be taken less seriously and seen as less of a serious threat by the public?
That's very interesting. It's a good question. In the beginning, Szyk said, I mocked them, I lampooned them, I satirized them. His cartoons changed as the war went on, because he said, now my cartoons are changing to that of hate. Szyk, as I mentioned last time, last lecture, he was a hater of hate. And so he turned it up a bit. And while they were caricaturish and cartoonish, there is a movement from lighthearted. I don't ever think it was lighthearted, but in the beginning it was lighter in nature. It moved from satire to actually downright hatred, as Szyk said in his own words. So look, caricature has the ability to exaggerate. I don't think at all you can look at the very most serious works that he did of Antichrist, the German authority in Poland, which I showed in this piece, Antichrist, which I showed in last one. He's dead serious on the kind of caricatures he's created. He never liked to be called a cartoonist. He never did. In fact, I think he probably preferred Illuminator more than anything else. But he was a cartoonist, but he was an illustrator. He was a painter, he was a liberator, he was all of them, certainly all combined to be an artist of and for the Jewish people. And I don't think, but I do think there was a transition in the kind of caricature and cartoon. And it's very different than any of the characters and cartoons of the other cartoonists, whether it was Roland Kirby, whether it was Dr. Seuss, whether it was Steinberg, whoever it was. Szyk's, as Roland Kirby pointed out, was different than that of any other, and one could see that as one begins to investigate the color and the depth of detail in some of the more magnificent works. So, yeah, I think I've said everything about that.
Thank you. We've talked a little bit about this in previous classes, but in case people weren't here for those or haven't had a chance to watch them yet, is Szyk's work present in any U.S. art museums or I guess art museums in general?
Yeah, well, the answer is that this past year I created a book called Arthur Szyk Preserved, Institutional Collections of Original Art, in which I identified over 30 institutions worldwide that house his original artwork. And so for those in New York, you have several museums, here, including Yeshiva University Museum, the Jewish Museum, Yeshiva University Museum. But then you have them as far and wide as the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the British Museum in London, Ein Harod, in Kibbutz Ein Harod, there's an original work of art in Israel. It's the only one that I know of in any institution in Israel, believe it or not. But yes, and the Magnus collection of Jewish art and life at UC Berkeley has the largest collection of Arthur Szyk original artwork in the world. I might add, it was a collection I built in which they acquired, so it's there. I know it's the largest, but this book, which is at your gift shop there, people can get it, or on the internet if they choose to go there, buy it from you. In any case, the answer is yes. There is lots of work. There's more than 670 works of Szyk that are in institutions, but don't let that be misleading, because Arthur Szyk created thousands of works of art. And I think by 1941, or by the end of 1941, I read in one source that he was quoted as saying that he had already created 1,000 works dealing with World War II before the end of pretty sure it was 1941. So there's several thousand works. So we have only a small number, but happily, almost all of the important works. There are still some out there, believe it or not. There are others out there. I know it for a fact of other important Arthur Szyk works that are not in institutions, that are in private hands today. And so, yeah, I hope this thoroughly answers the question. I hope.
Thank you. And I'll just mention that you can also buy the books that are in our museum gift shop online as well. And the links for that are in the chat. But I think that is a little bit of a segue to, can you recommend a book of Arthur Szyk's artwork?
With the book that if you had to buy one, I mean, buy two, buy three. If you start with one, and then they had two and three. The first one I would start with is Arthur Szyk, Soldier in Art. It's a book that I created in 2017. Believe me, it's still current. It has important essays and over 250 works of art that are shown within its pages. So I think if I had to recommend one book to go to, it'd be Arthur Szyk, Soldier in Art.
Amazing. And we do have that in our shop, and I'm going to put the link to that in the chat right now. The next question that we have that came in is, has Szyk ever been portrayed in a feature film?
The answer to that is no. Thanks for that question. I've been collecting footage of Arthur Szyk. I don't know, over 15 years, maybe 20 years now, where I've been, so I have 120 hours of footage. I'm dying to make a major motion picture. I've made 3 short documentary films about Szyk, which can be found on YouTube if you want to look, or on my website. You can go to films, the website's szyk.com, so that's easy. And you could see those short documentary films, 2 of which have played in numerous Jewish film festivals, actually. But the major motion picture has yet to be made. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful. Anybody has any ideas, contact me for sure. And but yes, it belongs. I actually have imagined myself sitting at the Academy Awards and going up. I'd make a very different kind of speech at the Academy Awards, believe me, if Arthur Szyk was called to world attention. But we'll have to wait and see. That's sort of my own sidebar. Okay.
Okay, so do you believe that there has been sort of a rejuvenation or maybe a renaissance in Arthur Szyk lately in recent years?
Yeah, I would say yes. It's not just over the past 7 years. It's really started, 20 years ago. It has continued to build. Diane Cole just recently wrote an article for the Forward about this resurgence of Szyk interest because of a lot of the events that have happened. I think the acquisition of the collection, the Magnus, has been important because they've traveled a Szyk exhibit to several venues. But major exhibitions of Szyk art have been taking place at major museums. I know I used the word major twice, but I really mean it. These are important exhibitions in important museums, starting with the Library of Congress in the year 2000. Well, actually, the Spertus Museum in Chicago in 1998-99, the Library of Congress in the year 2000, where the exhibition was called Arthur Szyk, Artist for Freedom, and was the first exhibition of the Library of Congress in the new millennium. In 2002, it was an exhibition of art and politics of Arthur Szyk at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. In 2008, a major exhibit took place in Berlin, for which a thick book was created, Arthur Szyk, Drawing Against National Socialism and Terror, which is a great book about Szyk. It's in German and English, the same book. So 2008, the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, and in 2017, the New York Historical Society hosted an exhibition in New York. So I'd say this resurgence of interest has been taking place over the past 2 decades, and I would say keeps reaffirming that Szyk has something to say, not only to us for understanding the period in which he lived, but it has something to say to us in our own time. And and he will always have something to say. But this is an artist that I can't stress it enough that this is not only an artist of the Jewish people, but this is an artist for the Jewish people. And as a heroic figure, and God knows we only need heroes. I think we can turn to Szyk's art, and I think more and more people, it's both the Jewish and non-Jewish world. And certainly in my book, Arthur Szyk preserved, one of the institutions that has a very significant collection now of Arthur Szyk is that Museum of George Lucas. It's the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art. That exhibition will, that museum will open next year, 2025. There is Arthur Szyk art in that institution, and this, again, a non-Jewish institution that is very proud to have Szyk, and I believe that millions of people and tens of millions of people will become more aware as Lucas calls more and more attention to Arthur Szyk. So I believe this renaissance is underway. It's not something the last year or two. It's but it is something that's been building over the past 2 decades for sure, as I hope that these museum exhibitions I pointed out to you indicate. At least they validate that I wasn't crazy when I got started and felt like, you know, I really believe in this artist. I think by institutions placing their money and their resources to promote Arthur Szyk, they're validating how important it is for the American public to become aware of who he is and where he stands, and to influence a world that isn't quite sure where it is, but to help us develop some sense of moral clarity about a world in which we have lived, and a world in which we live today. So, yeah, that's a long answer.
Do you, no worries. So do you think that Szyk was forgotten, or do you think he just kind of went into obscurity for a bit and then now is coming back?
I think he was forgotten. He was remembered by some who remembered his Haggadah. Yes, and he was remembered by some who remembered his illustrated Andersen's fairy tales. But there certainly were people who were putting together the idea that here was this Jewish artist who did the Haggadah, and that he was also the leading anti-Nazi artist in America during World War II. And there were those people who knew that he was a political artist, but didn't know that he was an illustrator of over 30 books. Contemporary tales and the Arabian Nights and Andersen's fairy tales. And those who knew his illustrated books didn't know that he was a proud Jew who did the Haggadah and Esther and Ruth and Job and Pathways Through the Bible as a Jewish artist. So, so the answer here is that, you know, he was forgotten. He was virtually forgotten. He was virtually forgotten. There was no major exhibitions of his art anywhere since 1974, when there was an exhibition at Yeshiva University Museum. And from the end of 1974 to over 25 years, there was nothing. There was no, people weren't writing articles. They weren't putting, you know, it was rare that you saw a Haggadah image on the front cover of a Jewish paper or inside of it when Passover was coming. You know, some people remembered him, but if you ask me, he was virtually forgotten. And but no more.
Thank you. So I know that you recommended Arthur Szyk's Culture and Art, but what would be the second book that you would recommend? And would it be
second book I'd recommend?
Other book?
Yeah, the second book I'd recommend is, well, there are others, but you know, his Haggadah first was published in 1940. It was in 1940 on vellum parchment. It was the most expensive new book in the world, that selling for tens of thousands of dollars in our time, but $500 in 1940. You know, as I say, you could buy a house, you know, on many a street in a major American city for $500. And then it's been republished. In 2008, I created a new edition of his Haggadah. And it's an expensive book. It's a luxury limited edition book, but it's grand. It's all hand created. But I'm not recommending that the second book you get is the expensive deluxe limited edition of the Haggadah. You can buy it. I'd be very happy. If you want to spend thousands of dollars on that, I'd only be delighted. It's worth every penny. But in 2011, I created a popular edition for Abrams books. And so it's the Szyk Haggadah published by Abrams. It's can be gotten in many places, and it's $20, and everybody can do it. It has an excellent commentary by Rabbi Byron Sherwin, who did the new translation and commentary, different from Cecil Roth's from 1940, and I'm responsible for that because I believe we needed a new translation and commentary to really tell us what Szyk was really up to. So the second book, if you have Soldier in Art and you want a book that he illustrated, then it would be the Haggadah. Of course, I'm not discounting any of the other books, for sure. Believe me, contact me. I'm happy to help you get them, but you can get them on the internet. You can get them in bookstores. You can get them at the museum.
Yeah, and I just put the link for the version that you were just discussing in the chat as well. So I'm going to combine a couple of questions that have come in just into one because they're on sort of similar themes. Do you see any people working in a similar style to Szyk today?
Yeah, I do. I got the other day something from artificial intelligence. It sent, I know this is not a serious answer to your question, but believe me, I just saw AI create something that was so incredible, so close, so exact to Szyk as it can do with so many things. But in any case, the answer is Stephen Heller, who was the art editor for the New York Times and New York Times Book Review for over 30 years, has a blog. And Steve just put out the other day, or sent to me, the artwork of a Soviet Jewish artist living here who he thought was inspired by Szyk's art. And so the answer is yes. There are those like Art Spielman whom I know and have and talked to, and Art feels that Szyk had some influence on him. In fact, Arthur Szyk's Satan Leads the Ball for many years it's a fold out of it was on his refrigerator in his workspace. So you know how you can put things up with magnets on your refrigerator. But the answer is yes. I really can't identify for you, though, the questioner, exactly who it is out there whose work is so similar. But of course I've seen them, but I'm not feeling confident in naming names at this point.
No worries. Thank you. So that is the last question that I had come in. So I think if you want to give us maybe a little bit of a preview of our last class, which will be in 2 weeks, I think that'd be awesome.
I will. We timed this series of 4 talks so that my last talk would be about the Haggadah 2 weeks before Passover. That would give you a chance to go out and buy the Szyk Haggadah and perhaps show it to those who are sitting around your table, if in fact you don't choose to use it. And the edition we created is a very usable one, unlike the earlier reproductions that were done that were not by instructions and so on. So I'm going to talk about the themes in Szyk's Haggadah. What is he really doing? What is he really saying? How do we really understand his Haggadah? In terms of it being heroic, in terms of his calling attention to what was going on in Europe through his Haggadah, of his calling attention to the fact that Jews should actually, in mid-1930s, leave Europe and go to Palestine. His Haggadah is different than any Haggadah that's ever been created. And my talk will start off with showing from the Maxwell House to the Szyk Haggadah and why I believe that the Szyk Haggadah stands at the top of all of those thousands of Haggadahs that have been created in terms of combining both its artistic components together with social action and activism, not only for its own day, but how this book can be seen in light of our own day. So I think it'll be worth tuning in if you're interested in understanding Arthur Szyk's magnum opus and what drove him to create, this among the greatest illuminated manuscripts of the 20th century. I mean, after all, people in his own day considered him the greatest illuminator in 400 years since the 16th century. Well, when you see the Szyk Haggadah in all its magnificence, you'll understand why.
Well, thank you so much for that preview for our next class. And as always, thank you so much, Irvin, for joining us today and for taking the time to be here. And we hope that you will join us for the final class in this series, which will be on April 8th. But as I said at the beginning, we have also added an in-person session on April 4th, where you can come meet Irvin in person and just get any additional questions answered. Um, so we hope you will also join us for that if you are able to do so. You can sign up for these classes at the link in the chat. If you enjoyed tonight's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mjhnyc.org/support and joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events.